Behind the Crime Scene with Gina Osborne and Tracy Miller. According to the FBI, some 33,000 violent street gangs, motorcycle gangs, and prison gangs are criminally active in the U.S. today. Many are sophisticated and well organized. All use violence to control territories and boost their illegal money-making activities, which include robbery, drug and gun trafficking, prostitution and human trafficking, and fraud. Many gang members continue to commit crimes even after being sent to jail. On the front lines, law enforcement battles every day to keep communities safe. This is their story.
Welcome to Behind the Crime Scene, where we go beyond the yellow tape and into the lives of first responders, investigators, and prosecutors who work true crime. I'm Gina Osborne, retired FBI Assistant Special Agent in Charge and former Army Counterintelligence Agent.
And I'm Tracy Miller. I've been a prosecutor for over 23 years, having prosecuted over 80 jury trials involving juvenile sexual assault, gang violence, and domestic violence. Today on the show, we have two law enforcement experts that I have worked with for over 20 years, Sergeant Julian Rodriguez and Detective Matt McLeod from the Santa Ana Police Department. And I'm really excited to have them on the show today, Gina, because there's so much people don't know about criminal street gangs.
You and I have both worked at gang cases, and when I was working Asian organized crime in Little Saigon, even back in the 90s, what I noticed was that they targeted their own communities.
Yes, and I've done gang cases in 3 different ways. I was a gang prosecutor, prosecuting some of the most violent gang criminals. I did gang injunctions, suing gangs civilly for causing a nuisance or terrorizing people that live and work in the community. And I started the largest gang prevention in the program in the nation to keep kids out of gangs. And you're right, they target their own communities. And they target people who are afraid to call for help. They're afraid to call law enforcement. They're afraid of revenge. And they will spray paint on the houses of snitches. And they will threaten their lives and sometimes kill what people they think are snitches or those that cooperate with law enforcement. And that's how they succeed.
We chose this case today to talk about. It's not a notorious case like the BTK Strangler or Chester Turner. It's not a case that you would have seen in the news.
This case is very territorial and very typical of gang cases because it is rivalry and revenge, all based on what is viewed as a sign of disrespect. But this case in particular is something out of the thousands of cases that I've either been a part of in some way, has definite twists and turns that impacts the family. People believe or have misconceptions about gangs that they're not exposed to it or that they're not at risk for gang crime, but innocent bystanders are unfortunately harmed by gang crime all the time.
I'm looking forward to hearing about these two heroes that have worked these cases for over 2 decades.
So am I. Let's go behind the crime scene and bring on Sergeant Rodriguez and Detective McLeod. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
My name is Julian Rodriguez. I am the supervising detective of the Santa Ana Police Department Homicide Unit, and I have over 24 years of law enforcement experience, the bulk of which I've spent as a detective, mostly in the homicide unit and in the gang unit as well, specializing in violent crime. Now I supervise my friends that I used to work with.
There you go.
That's a good job.
Yes.
That is a good job.
It's great work if you can get it.
Yeah, and Detective McLeod.
Yes, Detective Matt McLeod, Santa Ana Police Department, also homicide detective, as with my esteemed colleague here, just shy of 25 years, law enforcement service, but as well as going on 16 years as a homicide detective.
Wow.
Specializing in violent crimes, gang-motivated violent crimes here at the Santa Ana Police Department.
So coincidentally, Matt and I were both LAPD officers before we came to Orange County, and we were actually classmates.
Yes.
You were?
Yes.
Wow, you go way back.
Yeah.
And we both worked in gang-impacted divisions in Los Angeles. We spent 5 years and 6 years, respectively.
Yes.
So we cut our teeth there. So when we came to Santa Ana, we were able to kind of hit the ground running. It was a perfect environment for us to apply our craft.
Julian, will you tell everybody what a gang expert is?
So a gang expert is a person who has more knowledge than the average individual, who oftentimes works in some sort of a specialized unit dealing with gang members, collecting and maintaining gang intelligence, engaging in gang suppression activities, and then more specifically during the investigation of crimes and the prosecution, they sit in as the expert to discuss what a gang is, the definition of a gang, the facts of an instant case. They talk about the boundaries and the rivalries and all the different facets of what it means to be in a gang or participate in gang-motivated crime, to then explain to a jury how that knowledge fits into the law. Because there's a big disconnect sometimes when there's a crime and the juries don't understand the motivations behind that, and that's where the expert comes in.
So today's case we're talking about is a fascinating case where a double murder happened within hours of each other in Santa Ana. Matt, will you tell us how you found out about the first murder?
Was dismissal. And at that time, as was the case with several high schools, you have a lot of comings and goings of people who with the potentiality of having conflict. You had two groups of individuals, one being the victim and a very small group inclusive of the victim's girlfriend, and this secondary group. Now, prior to this incident, neither group had any conflicts with each other. We had no information that either group even knew of each other's existence. And due to what we found out later was basically a difference of opinion, as in someone staring at someone or something wholeheartedly insignificant, there was a physical confrontation. And the victim, a 14-year-old young man at that time, ended up getting stabbed multiple times in the upper torso and then transported to the hospital with severe injuries.
That staring is called a mad dog, right?
Yes, it is.
And so a mad dog, but basically a mean stare, ends up with a 14-year-old kid getting stabbed.
Yes.
How many people were stabbed him?
That we know of and that we found out later, there were 6 people involved in the assault on him. He was stabbed multiple times. We know of, through investigation and interview, that while there was one main assailant or aggressor, that at least 2 people were armed with cutting instruments or knives, and then he was also kicked and beaten with fists and hands.
Julian, did you know whether at this point the 14-year-old was a gangster, the one that's injured in the hospital?
Early on in the investigation, we really weren't sure. There was no documentation or anything to really suggest that, but that was our initial thought. We were operating under the assumption that there was a potential for this incident to be gang-related until proven otherwise.
And then how did you get your first leads as to who did this?
Well, the first leads came in terms of the descriptions of the assailants. Santa Ana being a predominantly Hispanic community, with the victim being once again a 14-year-old male Hispanic. It is not uncommon for there to be skirmishes or fights. However, all of the on-scene interviews that we conducted or were conducted by patrol identified the assailants as being male, predominantly Asians. And that is highly uncommon, especially at that time. And therefore, due to the fact that it happened in front of a high school, we started getting leads by just contacting school staff and figuring out who went to the school that fit that description.
I was tasked with a separate partner to go to the hospital and to try and receive the victim's family. They had gotten wind of this and they were congregating in the hospital, and our hope was to interview family members to see if they had any information about any underlying beefs that this kid may have had or anything like that, or if they had received any rumor or statements from witnesses that may have not come forward to police. So when we arrived at the hospital, the victim's family was there and they were in the waiting area outside of the ICU. The victim was there with his mother. And you can feel the tension. When we walked in there, it was like you could taste it, the tension that this family had and the anger that they had, and they did not want to talk to us and they were trying to leave, and we were able to kind of corral them a little bit and get some statements, but they were not cooperative, and you can tell that their mindset was not to further the police investigation, is the sense that I got. They just weren't that cooperative.
Is that typical of families that are close or associated with gangs?
It's not uncommon. Sometimes you get families that want to help and they express that, but they're like, I can't, or they try and surreptitiously give you information or point you in the right direction. But even the victim side is worried about being labeled a snitch, quote unquote, someone who's cooperating with law enforcement. But that was not the sense that I got. This was not, I don't want to be a snitch. This is, I'm just not going to cooperate with you.
So you're working this murder scene.
Correct.
You've got a victim that's 14 in the hospital.
Yes.
You've got 4 or 5 suspects. It's unusual because they're described as Asian gangsters or Asians that may be in a gang. And then you get a call that there's another murder in the city at the same time, a couple hours later?
Well, yes, actually, we were working this crime, and as the day wore on and we started to branch out and do our investigative duties, I got the telephone call that there was another homicide in almost within close proximity of the primary victim's residence.
What were you thinking, they were related at all?
First, after taking some smelling salts and realizing, wow, this is going to be a long, long night. Then
Gina knows those nights.
Oh, yeah. I worked Asian gangs back in the day,
She
so
knows
I know.
what that means.
Oh,
You're not
yes.
getting sleep, right?
No.
Yeah.
Not at all. We did develop that theory. It's going to do the proximity as well as where the secondary crime occurred, being a small area or segment of our city where the primarily Asian residents are known to either congregate or reside.
So was the victim an Asian person?
Of the second, yes. Of the second homicide, yes.
And how was he killed?
He was seated in the driver's seat of his vehicle. He had 2, if you will, companions who also occupied the vehicle. They were parked along the curb line just next to a major thoroughfare, which was juxtaposed by a train track or a segment of railroad tracks that connected a housing complex or apartment complex wherein the primary victim lived, and then as I had mentioned before, the separate houses where the Asian community are known to reside. Correct.
So was it a stabbing, a shooting? What happened?
The secondary homicide was a shooting wherein the victim, an adult male, and I believe he was Vietnamese, he was shot several times in the upper torso while seated in his vehicle. That occurred approximately, I want to say, in the late or afternoon to early evening hours.
Did he die immediately?
He did.
So now we have a 14-year-old Hispanic boy who was stabbed and in the hospital by someone in an Asian gang.
Correct.
The FBI is calling this a clue.
yes.
And now you have an Asian male who's been shot. So how are you piecing this together?
Well, the first clue that came from, in terms of the secondary homicide, as we're investigating the primary and getting descriptions of the suspects involved, and then we focused in on the secondary homicide, and we noticed, or the connection being that segment of railroad tracks, and that's a common thoroughfare that is traveled by community members in order to get from one area to the other. And when we talked to the intended victims or surviving victims of the shooting, they had made statements indicative of the suspects having traversed an area from those railroad tracks. And that was our first clue that led back to the suspects involved, who were actually family members of the victims from the first stabbing.
I believe I was at the station when I heard this other homicide go out. Very disheartening when you're sitting there working and you know it's already going to be a long night, and then you hear on the radio, we're always monitoring, and we hear that there's another shooting, and then they actually transported that gentleman to the hospital, and then they pronounced him deceased at the hospital. So ultimately, I did go back to the hospital now for the second case, and the decedent was at the same hospital where the 14-year-old was holding on for dear life. Coincidentally, the person who was killed, his mother, when she received the news, she had a heart attack and was transported to the same hospital as well. So there was a lot of chaos that night at the hospital with all these people together. And I don't remember specifically if the families realized that they were there for kind of the same extended reasons, but there's always that concern that now there's going to be more infighting at the hospital.
2 homicides at the same time,
Yes.
Investigations going on. When did you find out who was the suspect on the first case?
If you have a certain segment or swath of geographical area that is controlled predominantly by one gang, it is seen as a de facto no-no for another gang to come in there and commit any types of crimes, be they crimes of violence, tagging, property crimes, whatsoever. The area wherein the secondary shooting happened, that fell on the boundary, the southern boundary of the what is called the Little Mini Street Gang. And that was a big clue, being that the Little Mini Street Gang at that time was only comprised of maybe 15 to 20. And then of those people, when we went through our documentation at the Santa Ana Police Department, we noted that one individual happened to be a neighbor of who was eventually identified as the primary suspect.
It's important to point out back then in 2006, although there were surveillance cameras and things like that, it wasn't as prevalent as it is today.
Right.
Cell phone usage, especially amongst some street level people, was not as prevalent as it is today. So technology helps us a lot solve crimes. However, going back to the original question about being a gang expert, and I talked about gathering and maintaining gang intelligence and having all that information, what Matt is talking about is leaning on his experience, knowing what the gang intelligence is, knowing who the gangs are, where their boundaries are, who their rivalries are, and then formulating a hunch, something to work off of. But really on these gang cases, it's your ability to sit and talk to people that don't want to be talked to for a long, long time to extract information. So that hunch has to be solidified into evidence, or at least probable cause. And that's what Matt is really good at. And he probably won't tell you, but he's very good at sitting in front of people, victims, witnesses, suspects. I mean, we've sat together and interviewed multiple murderers hours on end just to get a tiny admission, or even worked just as hard to get an admission from a witness or a would-be victim. So taking all that experience, taking that knowledge, and then applying it to the facts of the case, and then reaching out and talking to the right people. And ultimately, people started piecing the puzzle together for us, and his job was to put it all together. And that's ultimately how we get to the named suspects.
So who's the suspect? Who did it? Who did the shooting?
The follow-up shooting, the primary suspect was the older brother of the stabbing victim.
So the 14-year-old boy's older brother,
Correct.
Hispanic male,
Yes.
in the hospital with his mother,
Yes.
killed the Asian male in the car.
Correct.
Wow.
Once you piece that together, did you talk to the mother again?
Yes. I believe this was into the next day, and her son was still alive, but it was pretty much a foregone conclusion that he was going to die. And as any mother would be, she was just distraught, but she's a very stoic woman, I remember. And my heart went out to her because she seemed like a good parent, was doing what she could, under these circumstances, leading up to it. Even trying to raise her sons was the impression that I got. Like, her mindset was that of taking care of her children. And knowing us being armed with the information that her other son committed this murder, and me already thinking many steps ahead of what this means for her, I had to go there and ask her where her son was. And, I don't harbor any guilt about it, but I do feel a little bit bad that I had to lie to her and extract that information from her, I told her we're working on this murder, which we were, but I needed to speak to her son again. And he had gone on the run after he committed his crime. And it's funny, we talked about not sleeping, because this was probably the longest we ever worked straight in my recollection. I think we went 3 days straight.
Yes. No sleep.
From the day we showed up to work, the first murder happened, the second murder happened, and we worked 2 nights through. So 3 days total before we went home, because it all just started coming to fruition. And ultimately, the information that the mom gave us was that one little tip that we needed to be able to track him down, and he had fled to another county. And we reached out to some law enforcement partners in that county to help affect that arrest.
Did the people the older brother killed, were they the ones that stabbed his younger brother at the school?
No, completely unrelated.
Did he think he was killing the people that were stabbed his younger brother at school?
Our belief, and this is through statements made by the older brother as well as other people, was that while they had no information if that was the actual stabber that was killed, that they believed they were from the same gang and then from the underlying Asian criminal street gang subculture.
Were they from the same gang?
No.
And that again speaks to the criminal gang subculture. There's this concept that you have to retaliate, equal or greater than. So the retaliation need not be against a specific person. So it is all related to the gang. In their mind, they were going after a rival gang member, even though they were wrong. And I think in my heart, I believe that the brother, had a little bit of blind rage at the time, and he went after the first person that he could. But it didn't have to even be the stabber. It just had to be someone from that gang to get retribution.
So now you have this mother whose son eventually dies.
Correct.
And another son who's looking at life in prison or worse. How was that interaction with her?
I remember at the inception when we took her older son into custody, she was still, of course, primarily concerned with the passing of her younger son. But then, as is the case with anyone, you make notifications and follow-up interviews in terms of substantiating or debunking any alibis. We did speak with her again, the mother, and several family members, and just like Julian had mentioned, she remained stoic throughout. I couldn't characterize her as being overly cooperative. However, as was my interpretation, it's like she understood why he did what he did. She almost, I wouldn't say knew that it would happen, but just kind of accepted it and was of the mindset of, okay, I get it.
This all started with a mad dog look,
Yes.
stare. And starting with a stare, that the first gang wasn't even going after that intended victim.
Correct.
And then the older brother killing unintended second person.
Correct.
It all is based on the retaliation and the gang culture and the mentality. And this woman loses virtually both sons because of that.
Well, and Matt touched on it previously about the respect issue. That is the driving force in the criminal gang subculture, at least predominantly amongst Hispanics where we work. And respect, we have to qualify that, because when we sit here and have a conversation about respect, it's not the same as the way gang members view it. It is based solely on fear and intimidation. How much fear and intimidation can you exert, or you being the representation of your gang, pushing that fear and intimidation into a community, to your rivals, to the normal folks that live in your neighborhood that are not gang members, whatever it may be. Violence rules. And those who are the most adept at violence, that is really the status mobility vehicle in the criminal gang subculture, is if they could be violent, or if they can create or commit crimes that benefit the gang, selling drugs, stealing things, procuring weapons, carrying the weapons, whatever it may be. But there is certainly a pecking order, and the people at the top of that pecking order are the ones that are the most violent, because then they get everything else that they want.
Which trial happened first? The trial of the 14-year-old that was a victim, or the trial of against the older brother?
The court proceedings were kind of interspersed. It was really a to and fro, but the first trial was of the stabbing victim. Those two, I remember there was a main stabber and then a secondary. They went first. When we spoke with the mother at that time, and she attended hearings and everything like that, she had that same stoicism. She was just seated there, taking all the information in, and of course, pain beyond belief, but understanding of everything. And then during the follow-up, the shooting trials, of course, due to the fact that her son was on trial now on the other side, she again exhibited the same stoic attitude, same attentiveness to the case, did not waver. There was no hysteria during either one. It was more just focus.
Were both cases result in conviction?
Yes.
What did the older brother get?
The older brother, he resulted in the conviction for a second-degree murder, and then all the enhancements of firearm usage during the commission of the crime, the gang enhancements, and all the lessers that were involved in that.
So how much time did he get?
I believe his ultimate sentencing was, at that time, it was 40 to life.
And what about the kids that stabbed the younger brother?
So the two adults, the primary aggressor, he got sentenced to first-degree murder, the use of a deadly weapon. He got the gang enhancements. His final sentence, it was life without parole. For the secondary, he got second degree, also gang enhancements, and his was in the area of 40 years to life with that adjudications. And then the minors, they were sentenced in juvenile court.
All of these lives destroyed over starting with a disrespectful mad dog.
Correct. Mm-hmm. Yes.
You two have been doing this for a really long time, and you see things like this happen, I'm sure, time and time again with regard to the gang crime issues that you're dealing with in your city. How does that impact you, having to see this so long? How does it impact you as human beings?
I think there's probably a price that will be paid. I don't think necessarily it's come to fruition yet. I know it weighs on me at times, and with as much as I loved the work, and I really loved working with the people that I worked with, that was one of the reasons that I decided to promote. I was too mentally and emotionally invested in the things that I was doing, because I'm kind of an all or nothing person. Mm-hmm. I think that was my way of kind of having a good exit strategy. It's just not something that I had intended when I started. I just thought, I'm going to run this through to the end, because it was such a dream job for me. So I think I dealt with it by separating myself, because I knew that it was starting to affect me emotionally. And then I was able to kind of come full circle and be now kind of the supervisor, but mostly like the protector for the guys that were my partners are now the guys that work for me. And I use that term loosely because that's what the hierarchy says, but really I feel like I work for them to create an environment that is safe and as healthy as possible with, all the outside pressures and the commitments at home, and trying to balance all those things and knowing what it's like to actually sit in their shoes, and knowing that I need to only suggest that we have to do something before everyone goes in 100%. That's been good for me, to kind of do that. It detached me from the cases, because I know I was waking up every morning, and after I got to a certain point where I had too many victims, I couldn't keep them all straight anymore. So I really started focusing on the suspects that were outstanding. And I remember sitting at home at the dinner table and having conversations with me. And all I was thinking about was my cases and what I was going to be doing. And, when I was at home, I wanted to be at work. And when I was at work, I felt guilty. I wanted to be at home. And I could never be in the right place and the right mental state. And it was weighing on me quite a bit. So it is a tough job.
And Detective McLeod, you are the OG
yes.
of this unit. I mean, how has it impacted you?
In several facets, as the OG, de facto OG, I remember, just as Julian had mentioned, at the inception of my career, I remember being, that hard-charging officer, detective, just everyone. I was going to gain justice for everybody in every single case, and I was going to solve everything. And then you begin to internalize things, and as Julian had mentioned, you begin to take it home, and you begin to think about things, ad nauseum. And I remember distinctly, as I became older and as I began to see the individuals with whom I dealt, both on the suspect side as well as on the victim side, for those who survived, as they grew, and aged, and then you could see different people, and then you see their sons or their daughters or family members took on a different light. And that effect caused me to look within myself and say, what am I doing with my life? Where am I going with all these? While I still care about the cases and, of course, the survivors and surviving victims and the families, I began to take a step back and began to take more of a fatherly role, and that branched out also to the members of the unit. We're all brothers in blue, as they say. Now I'm more of the, okay, well, let's hold on. Let's think about this. What are the implications? What are we doing? Let's take a broader view of these gang cases. But I think one of the hardest things that's always kind of been hard for me to deal with is when you deal with our gang-motivated crimes, it's a subculture that goes beyond understanding. For those of us who understand or come from a basic morals viewpoint, where there's no rhyme or reason. And at times I still feel myself taken aback when you look into the eyes of a 14 or 15-year-old and they say, well, I shot him, I had to, because he disrespected the neighborhood. And it's kind of hard to still understand that, even after going on 25 years, to see at what point have we come wherein a 14-year-old values life just so minimally that that's the reasoning for taking another's life.
People listening to this may live within a mile of some of these territories in multi-million-dollar houses surrounding Santa Ana. What do you want them to know that you've learned throughout your careers about criminal street gangs that you think they don't understand?
It's changed a lot over the years. It used to be very compartmentalized, and gang crime and gang neighborhoods were very centered around a geographic area. And while we still have a lot of that, there has been like this dispersal of gang members, technology again. People are more mobile, and gang crime is going to go wherever they're going to make money. And so law enforcement efforts, put pressure on neighborhoods, and so they just adapt, and it disperses that crime. And it may be, in your neighborhood, or some gang members, have jobs in an outside regular life, and they might be painting houses, or they might be doing construction, or any kind of work. We had a Mexican mafia associate working at a major trauma center in an administrative capacity some years ago. So they're out there in the world amongst us. It's just something to be cognizant of, and perhaps maybe not be so closed-minded to the idea that it's not going to happen to you. You have to keep your wits about you, I think.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing that I would have them take away is that these crimes, especially the ones that we deal with, the ultimate in terms of violence, that they are so far-reaching that while you may think that this only happens in this city, or my city is never known for this, it's almost as in it hasn't happened yet, but never discount the power of, the gang subculture. We've seen it reach out to people who are from well-to-do families, people who have political connections. I've interviewed people who were so steeped into the gang life, but they had such a stable upbringing. It wasn't, this gang association isn't motivated from poverty. It is not solely socioeconomic conditions. It has nothing to do. Some of the gang members that I've talked to, and I've told them to their faces, they are some of the most intelligent people that I have ever come across. But it is that power and that pull that can draw them in. Could be, just as Julian is saying, could be, the person that you're passing in the street. It could be that bank teller. Could be somebody who is going to be vying for a seat on the city council. You never know.
What's weird, I think, over the last couple of decades is that, like Matt said, at one point, becoming a gang member or being indoctrinated into the gang subculture was a product of your environment. Like, there were no choices, and gangs are almost always born out of a need to defend themselves from other established groups or from racism. Typically, if you look historically across the United States, from east to west, when gangs formed. And most recently with popular culture, whether it's music, TV, movies, whatever it is, there's this affinity for that violent street gang subculture, even if it's non-specific. The ideology of making money and not valuing life, and some of the things that get rapped about or sung about, things like that. And so it permeates the culture that these kids are being raised in. And we get kids who come from good backgrounds. Both parents are in the home, both parents work, they pay for a private education, they pay for anything and everything that they can, and they offer them all the things in life that 20 years prior these kids weren't getting, which led them into gangs. And now these kids are choosing to go because it's been offered to them subconsciously. And that's not every kid who listens to gangster rap or whatever, but in some cases we do experience that, and that's very disheartening, because that becomes a choice to go out and live that lifestyle. And it seems like there's a disconnect between what the real consequences are and what the lifestyle brings. And some people live that lifestyle and they're kind of like playing in the role, and then they find themselves in the role with somebody who has real intentions, and they have to make hard choices sometimes.
Well, I am the only one at this table who is retired, and I can tell you that I am so proud of our profession, my former profession, your profession, watching how professional you both are, and just how you fight the fight every day for the good of your community. And so thank you so much for your service.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that.
We started this off by saying, I think I did your first gang expert, but the truth is, in the last 20 years, both of you individually have taught me so much, and you are leaders in the Orange County community, law enforcement community, and it's such an honor to have worked with you, been your colleague, and to have you on Behind the Crime Scene.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Appreciate it.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Tracy, that was awesome.
It was so inspiring. They've inspired me my whole career, so I knew that they would be great on the podcast. But when you asked them the question of how does this impact you, seeing the sadness in these murders over and over and over again, their answers were so authentic.
Mm-hmm.
And the balance that they're always trying to find in their life, I think that's something we can all do no matter what career we're in, is to try to find that balance without getting hardened or getting desensitized.
We both worked gangs in our career. You still work gangs in your career. And just what surprises me, I worked gangs back in the 90s. Nothing's changed. It's the lack of value for human life in the gang world.
And the fact that the youngest age in the state of California that people get exposed to gangs is 8 years old. The fact that it's young kids that are being exposed to this lifestyle, and just this one case, Gina, the amount of lives that were destroyed. Not only that poor mother, that has one son in prison for the rest of his life and one 14-year-old son dead, but the mother of the other victim who had a heart attack because she lost her son.
Yeah, I mean, it's just tragedy everywhere you look.
And all of the other people involved in both homicides that are spending life in prison. So many lives destroyed that started with a disrespectful stare.
Unbelievable.
And I like what they said about how gangs have changed, and just blocks away there's people living their lives that don't know, and to be aware.
Absolutely.
If you have suggestions on things you want to hear about, please go to behindthecrimescene.com and contact us and let us know.
If you reach out to us like one of our listeners did, we will try and find people who were involved in that case and get a behind the crime scene look at it.
Go to your local podcast provider and subscribe, and tell your friends to subscribe. And we'll see you next time on Behind the Crime Scene.
Behind the Crime Scene with Gina Osborne and Tracy Miller is produced and edited by Lisa Osborne. Theme music is Insomnia by retired IRS Special Agent Clarissa Balmaceda. Find us on social media through BehindTheCrimeScene.com. And don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Behind the Crime Scene with Gina Osborne and Tracy Miller wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Lisa Osborne.